My dad disowned my sister and he's dying. How do I convince her to let him go? It was a typical Saturday in 2003. Nothing seemed out of place. The house was quiet, except for the occasional laughter from the TV in the living room, where Dad was going through some old mail that had piled up. We had no idea that pile held a ticking time bomb that was about to blow our family apart. Dad was the kind of guy who liked to keep things organized. On that Saturday in 2003, my dad was trying to clear out junk mail and old bills. But he found something different. An envelope with romantic messages and hotel receipts. It was clear that Mom was having an affair. And it wasn't just with anyone. It was with John, her childhood best friend. John and my dad were inseparable since grade school. They shared everything, from baseball cards to life's biggest moments. John was more than a friend. He was the brother Dad never had. He was never the best man at my parents' wedding. He stood proudly by my dad's side as he vowed to love my mom for better or worse. Now, the irony of those vows is laid bare. It all started when my dad first saw those receipts and love notes. He sat there in disbelief. His hands trembled as he tried to piece together the timeline, the secret meetings, and the betrayal from the two people he trusted most. Felt like a slap in the face. It was a betrayal that reached. It was a gut-wrenching experience. I was at home that day in my room working on a school project. I was unaware of the turmoil brewing downstairs. It wasn't until I heard a loud thud that I went down to check. There was Dad sitting on the floor with receipts and letters scattered around him. His face was a picture of anguish. "What's wrong, Dad?" I asked, kneeling beside him. I tried to make sense of the scattered papers. He didn't answer at first. He just shook his head as if trying to wake up from a bad dream, but it wasn't a dream. With a shaky voice, he finally put words to his pain. "It's your mom and John. They've been seeing each other." He handed me a hotel receipt dated just last week. The room fell silent. The weight of his words hung heavily between us. I didn't know what to say or do. My mind raced with images of Mom and John. The times. They were a bit too friendly, and their laughter was a bit too loud. It all made a twisted sense now. Dad spent the next hour explaining everything he had found, with each detail. His voice grew more resigned. He was a man coming to terms with his shattered reality. He had always been the strong one, the problem solver, the foundation of our family. Seeing him like this, broken and defeated, was something I had never prepared for. The days that followed were a blur of hushed phone calls and closed-door conversations. Dad confronted Mom, who at first denied everything but the evidence. It was too damaging to ignore. She finally admitted to the affair. Her words were hollow, her excuses flimsy. She said she just fell out of love, and John was there. Her voice was void of the warmth it once had. She said she was sorry he had to find out this way. She was sorry, but it was too late. She had made up her mind. She was leaving him for JN. The news spread like wildfire. We kids reacted in different ways. Disbelief, anger, sadness. It all came together to create a big, messy situation that threatened to tear our family apart. Sarah, my sister, took it the hardest. She was always the apple of Dad's eye. She was the one who could do no wrong. But in the weeks that followed, she changed. She grew distant. She came home less often. Her conversations with Dad were strained and awkward. I think she blamed him for not being enough, for not keeping Mom happy. But I knew it was more complicated than that. It was about her loyalties being tested and her life being uprooted. Mom and John moved in together not long after the divorce papers were filed. It was quick and almost ruthlessly so. They settled in a fancy part of town, and it seemed like Mom had a whole new life that didn't include us unless it was convenient. Dad, on the other hand, tried to keep things as normal as possible for us. As normal as possible for us, but it was clear there was a lot of tension. He lost weight, his smiles became rarer, and the light in his eyes dimmed. Looking back, I realized that day marked the end of a lot of things. Trust, family unity, and the innocence that once colored our daily lives. Dad's discovery wasn't just about infidelity. It was the unraveling of the tapestry of our family, thread by thread, until we were just individuals struggling to understand how the warmth and love we once shared had turned into cold, hard betrayal. What was once shared had turned into cold, hard betrayal as I watched Dad try to rebuild his life. His spirit was bruised but not broken. I learned about the resilience of the human heart, but the scars remained a constant reminder of the day our family changed forever. After the storm that was Mom's departure, the house felt different, emptier somehow, even with all of us still living there. Dad did his best to keep things normal, but you could tell he was just going through the motions. His heart wasn't in it anymore. I don't blame him. His best friend and wife had turned his life upside down in the middle of all this chaos. Sarah, my twin sister, had always been Dad's little girl. You'd think she'd stick by him through something like this. But things didn't turn out that way. Instead, Sarah became more and more withdrawn from Dad. As time went by, she became closer to Mom and, by extension, to John. It was like watching someone switch sides in slow motion. Sarah's decision to stay with Mom after she moved out was a shock to all of us. She was 27 and made her own decisions, but this was different. It felt like a betrayal on top of a betrayal. Dad tried to hide his disappointment, but there was a hurt in his eyes that was hard to miss. He'd lost his wife, and now it felt like he was losing his daughter too. The whole dynamic in our family shifted. Weekends, which used to be loud and full of life, became tense and awkward. Sarah would come when she moved out. It was a shock to us all. She was 27 and had the right to make her own decisions, but it felt like a betrayal on top of a betrayal. Dad tried to hide his disappointment, but there was a hurt in his eyes that was hard to miss. He'd lost his wife, and now it felt like he was losing his daughter too. The whole dynamic in our family shifted. Weekends, which used to be loud and full of life, became tense and awkward. Sarah would come. It was clear she was just going through the motions. Conversations were stilted, filled with long silences where there used to be laughter. It was like she was a guest in her own home, unsure of her place or what to say. Things got even more complicated when Sarah announced she was thinking of changing her career path. From as early as I can remember, she'd wanted to be a doctor like Dad. He was a surgeon, and she'd always said she wanted to follow in his footsteps. Out of the blue, she started talking about going to law school instead. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Mom and JN were behind this. They were both lawyers, and it seemed they had their own plans for her. Dad was crushed. It was one thing to lose his wife to his best friend, but losing his daughter's aspirations too, that was a different kind of pain. He tried to talk to her about it and try to understand her decision, but Sarah was adamant. "It's just something I need to do," she'd say, "myself," but her words felt hollow. It was clear this wasn't just about her. John became a constant presence in her life, mentoring her, helping her with her law school applications, and even offering her a job at his firm once she graduated. It was like he was grooming her to take his place, erasing the parts of her that reminded him of Dad. The change in Sarah was hard to watch. She became more like Mom, ambitious, sure, but also distant and calculating. The warmth that used to define her seemed. Dad tried to reach out to her, but it was never easy. He supported her decision to go to law school, even though he had reservations. He showed up at her graduation, beaming with pride, even though she'd be joining a firm, not a hospital. The divide grew deeper with every passing year. Holidays were especially hard. Sarah would show up, but she was always in a hurry to leave to get back. To her new life with Mom and John, it felt like we were just checkboxes on her list of obligations, not her family. It wasn't just Dad who felt the shift. The rest of us did too. We tried to understand and be supportive, but it was tough. We missed our sister, the one who used to sneak out with us to go to movies and who'd spend hours talking about everything and nothing. Sarah was gone, and in her place was someone we barely recognized. It wasn't just the personal changes. It was a painful realization. Seeing someone you love choose the people who had caused so much pain over the family that had always been there for her was a stark reminder of what we'd lost. As Dad's health declined, I watched him grapple with the image of the daughter he raised and the woman Sarah had become. He still loved her, but that love was complicated. Dad's love was clear, but there was a resignation in it now, a sadness that spoke of things irrevocably changed. Looking back, those years were a slow unraveling of the tight-knit family we once were. We were all dealing with the fallout in our own ways. But for Dad, the betrayal was a double-edged sword, cutting deep and leaving wounds that no amount of time seemed able to heal. Sarah's shift in allegiance didn't just change her relationship with Dad. It changed her relationship with we all became bystanders in our transformation, witnesses to a shift that none of us had wanted, but that we had to accept. It was a painful realization that sometimes, no matter how much you want to hold on, you have to let go. We did, each of us, adjusting to the new normal in our own way, holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could one day be mended. But as each day passed, that hope grew dimmer, overshadowed by the reality of our family was falling apart. 2017 was supposed to be a good year, a fresh start. We were hoping that Sarah was getting married. Despite all the tension, there was excitement around the event. Dad was always optimistic. He wanted to make the best of it. He had always looked forward to seeing Sarah in a wedding dress, walking her down the aisle, and handing her off to a new life of happiness. It was supposed to be one of those key moments, a bright spot in the messy. After our family split up, Sarah knew how much this meant to Dad. We all did too. So when Dad wrote her a blank check for the wedding, it wasn't just about the money. It was a gesture. It was his way of saying he was still there for her, no matter what. He talked about it all the time. Whenever weddings came up on TV or when we attended one as guests, he'd say, "It's going to be just perfect." The planning went on for months. Despite their strained relationship, Dad was involved every step of the way. He never let his personal feelings toward Mom and John interfere with his efforts to be there for Sarah. He attended every tasting, every dress fitting, always enthusiastic, always supportive. Then, just one day before the wedding, everything came crashing down. Sarah dropped the news casually, almost too casually, during what we thought was a final routine check-in. She said, "Oh, by the way, I decided that JN and Dad are both going to walk me down the aisle." Through her planner, she didn't even look up. The room went still. You could almost hear the collective heart drop. Dad's face, I will never forget it. It was as if someone had punched him right in the gut. The hurt was palpable, etched deep in his expression. Both of us. His voice was calm, but you could hear the tremor of suppressed emotion. Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes flickered between Dad and me as if she was weighing how much to reveal. "Well, John's been a big part of my life too. It just feels right to have you both there." Dad tried to understand her point of view, but it was clear he was struggling. "Sarah," his voice trailed off at the end of the sentence. It was like he was dreaming of something that might never come true. The argument that followed was unlike any we'd seen before in our family. Dad usually avoided confrontation at all costs, but he couldn't hold back his pain and disappointment. It all came pouring out in a rush of words that seemed out of character for him. "You want him there after everything, after what they did." Dad's voice rose, a rare occurrence that marked the gravity of his feelings. Sarah was defensive, her words sharp and cutting. "He's been there for me in ways you just haven't been lately." That stung. Watching Dad's face crumple at her words was almost too much to bear. The fight escalated, voices raised, harsh words thrown like daggers, slicing. Despite the closeness of the family, in the end, Dad couldn't do it. He couldn't face standing next to John, the man who helped end his marriage and his family. If that's what Sarah wanted, he said, he couldn't take part. He was firm. Sarah tried to get him to change his mind, thinking he might give in. But Dad was set on staying away from the wedding. He stayed home, drinking and feeling sorry for himself. There was silence and solitude while Sarah walked down the aisle with John by her side. The fallout from that decision was huge. Our family was already struggling, and this made things even worse. Dad and Sarah's relationship, which had always been a source of happiness for him, broke down completely. Many in the family sided with Dad, viewing Sarah's decision as the ultimate betrayal, not just of her father but of all the values we thought we shared. After the wedding, Sarah tried several times to make things better. Dad was done. He'd once been open and forgiving, but after the wedding, his heart had hardened. The wedding photos, which should have been a treasure, became a symbol of what was lost. They showed a beaming Sarah, beautiful in her dress, but beside her was John, smiling broadly as if he hadn't a care in the world. The years that followed were tough. Sarah tried to reconcile with Dad, but he was cold and indifferent. She was either absent or, if present, treated with a chilly indifference. Dad's politeness was worse than outright anger. Even as his health declined, the wounds from the wedding day remained unresolved and painful. The man who had once been the life of every party and the heart of our family had retreated into a shell of his former self. His joy was dimmed by the shadows of past hurts. As I watched all this unfold, I wondered if there would ever be a way back for Sarah and Dad, or if some choices once made left scars too deep to ever. Dad's health started to decline rapidly earlier this year, and with it, any hope of reconciling with Sarah seemed to slip away too. The man who had once been larger than life, always the first to crack a joke or offer a comforting word, was now a shadow of his former self. Pancreatic cancer is ruthless. Watching him struggle through treatment after treatment with no real hope of recovery was probably one of the hardest things our family has ever had to endure. Sarah's efforts to reconnect seemed desperate and a bit insincere to some of us. That might be unfair. She probably had regrets, and her reaching out might have been genuine, but to Dad, it was too little, too late. The hurt from the wedding, where she chose John over him, had cut too deep. He had closed that chapter of his life, and no amount of pleading or apologies from Sarah could open it again. Why now? Dad would mutter whenever her name came up. He just feels guilty. It's not about me. It's about her trying to clear her conscience. Maybe he was right, or maybe it was his way of coping with the pain. Either way, he was adamant about not seeing her, not even when she offered to come over to try to make amends and be part of his life again. The tension this created within our family was palpable. Some relatives thought Dad should forgive her and not let these final days be shadowed by the past. They'd argue that as her father, he should forgive her and move on from the hurt and betrayal. But Dad was set on not having her around. It was a strange time. You know how illness can change a person? Dad, who was once the most forgiving soul, had become hardened and more cynical. It wasn't just the cancer eating away at his body. It was the bitterness and unresolved anger we all felt. It was like a heavy cloud hanging over the house, making those last few months even more strained. Sarah, for her part, didn't push too hard. Maybe she finally understood the depth of Dad's feelings, or maybe she was protecting herself from further rejection. She sent cards and occasionally checked in with me or my other siblings to see how he was doing, but she never came to visit. Then, as Dad's days became numbered, the reality of losing him hit us all like a ton of bricks. I found myself torn, wanting to honor his wishes while also wishing for a Hollywood-style reunion where everything was magically resolved. Real life isn't like the movies, though. There are no endings. No perfect resolutions where everyone hugs and forgives just before the credits roll. I spent a lot of time with Dad during those last weeks, just sitting with him, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching old westerns on TV. He loved those quiet moments. I'd sometimes bring up Sarah, tentatively testing the waters, but he'd shake his head. I wanted to honor his wishes, but I also wished for a Hollywood-style reunion where everything was magically resolved. The reality is that life isn't like the movies. There are no endings, no perfect resolutions where everyone hugs and forgives just before the credits roll. I spent a lot of time with Dad during those last weeks, just sitting with him, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching old westerns on TV. He loved those in those quiet moments. I'd sometimes bring up Sarah, tentatively testing the waters, but he'd shake his head. He'd say, "Let's just enjoy the movie." And I'd let it go, knowing I couldn't win. Dad's health started to decline rapidly earlier this year, and with it, any hope of reconciling with Sarah seemed to slip away. The man who'd once been larger than life, always the first to crack a joke or offer a comforting word, was now a shadow of his former self. Pancreatic cancer is ruthless. It was tough watching Dad go through treatment after treatment with no real hope of recovery. It was probably one of the hardest things our family has ever had to endure throughout this ordeal. Sarah's attempts to reconnect felt desperate and a bit insincere to some of us. Maybe that's unfair. She probably did have regrets, and maybe her reaching out was genuine, but to Dad, it was too little, too late. The hurt from the wedding, from her choosing John over him, had cut too deep. He'd closed that chapter of his life, and no amount of pleading or apologies from Sarah could open it again. Whenever her name came up, he'd mutter, "She's just feeling guilty. That's all. It's not about me. It's about her. She's trying to clear her conscience." He was right, or maybe it was his way of coping with the pain. Either way, he was adamant about not seeing her, not even when she offered to come over to try to make amends. It was clear that having her back in his life would cause a lot of tension in our family. Some of his relatives thought he should forgive her and not let the last few days be overshadowed by past conflicts. They'd say, "She's still your daughter. The biological tie should override the years of hurt and betrayal." But Dad was stubborn, and his decision was final. He didn't want her there, and that was that. It's strange, you know how illness can change a person? Dad was once the most forgiving. Soul had become hardened and more cynical. It wasn't just the cancer eating away at his body. It was the bitterness and unresolved anger we all felt. It was a heavy cloud hanging over the house, making those last few months even more strained. Sarah, for her part, didn't push too hard. Maybe she finally understood the depth of Dad's feelings. Or maybe she was protecting herself from further rejection. She sent cards and called occasionally, always checking in with me or my other siblings to see how he was. She never came to visit, not once. Then, as Dad's days became numbered, we all realized how much we'd miss him. I found myself torn between honoring his wishes and wishing for a Hollywood-style reunion where everything was magically resolved. Real life isn't like the movies, though. There are no neat endings or perfect resolutions where everyone hugs and forgives just before the credits roll. I spent a lot of time with Dad during those last weeks. I'd sit with him sometimes, talk to him sometimes, and sometimes just watch old westerns on TV. He loved those in those quiet moments. I'd sometimes bring up Sarah, tentatively testing the waters, but he'd shake his head and shut down the conversation before it could really start. He'd say, "Let's just enjoy the movie." And I'd let it go, knowing this was not a battle I could win. I'm very close to my dad, and the last few weeks are really difficult for me. Do I convince her to let him go? I'm updating this one a week after I posted the original. My dad started getting worse. His health declined really fast, and we lost him exactly 1 month ago. It wasn't pretty. I never thought it would be, but I never thought it would be that heartbreaking. He was in a lot of pain. He's been through so much in these last months. As heartbreaking as it was to us, he deserved to rest. He was tired in the end. He was lucid. He told me and my older brother goodbye. It was one of the most painful and beautiful moments of my life. He said some things that meant a lot to me, but I won't go into detail because I think it's too personal. He also said goodbye to my daughters, who are 11 months old and 2 years old. He gave them a kiss on the forehead and told them to be good girls. He told them he loved them, and it was something I'll never forget. It's heartbreaking that they're so young and already understand what happened. They still ask about Grandpa, and every time I try to explain that he isn't coming back, they don't seem to understand. How can I blame them? I'm only 27, and they honestly don't get it. I was supposed to get a lot more years with my dad, and it doesn't seem fair. The worst part was that my twin sister Sarah's dad died without speaking to her. I tried to talk to him about her, but he wasn't interested. She started getting more desperate, and then he died. It was expected, but she was in denial. His funeral was beautiful. A lot of people shared their stories about him. It was nice. Sarah saw Dad for the first time since the night before her wedding, and she didn't recognize him. He was very skinny. Dad was always a bit overweight. The dad bod was famous, but he'd lost a lot of weight from cancer. She cried a lot during the funeral. Mom and John tried to show up at the ceremony, but my uncles kicked them out of the funeral. It was good freaking Britain's dads will dance as one. Family came from old money, petrochemicals, so he always had a lot of money. He left a little bit of money in properties divided equally to all his kids, including Sarah. He set up a trust fund, which was a lot of money for all his grandkids, including Sarah's kids, who she never met. It was honestly expected. My dad never really cared about money that much. He just wanted us to be comfortable and sure that his grandkids all had something to support them. The tricky part was the personal things. He left a really big letter to all of us except Sarah. It was really personal stuff in my letter. He spoke to me about our story about my childhood. It was really nice. I'm pretty sure I read the letter 100 times and cried every single time. One of my dad's favorite hobbies was photography. He was quite an enthusiast, and a lot of his photos were of our family. When my mom was around, that was a different story. Later on, it turned out to just be me and my siblings. As a result, we have a lot of pictures of us growing up. He gave each of us a photo album and wrote something about where the photo was taken and a few words behind each one. I was really surprised by this gift. It was a very thoughtful goodbye gift, something that was very typical of my dad. Sarah didn't get any letter, and her album didn't have anything behind her photos. When she found out about this, she had a mental breakdown. She was really struggling with her regrets. She was admitted to a hospital and spent an entire week there. She's doing a bit better now, getting a little better every day. I'm really confident in her recovery. She's sleeping and eating almost normally now. She still cries randomly multiple times a day, but she's getting better. That's what I'm telling myself. Last week, my wife and I discovered that we're expecting again. It wasn't planned. My wife switched birth control last month. She spent a week without taking the pill. It's still very early in her pregnancy, so I haven't told anyone yet. The thing is, I'm really angry. I'm angry that my future kid is not going to be able to meet my dad. I'm freaking pissed. Honestly, it doesn't seem fair at all. I'm angry and I'm scared. My dad was supposed to guide me in the whole parenthood process. He was teaching me a lot with my daughter. Now I'm scared of doing this without him. I'm scared of not being a good. I want my kids to have the same relationship with their dad that I did. This whole situation could be a lot better. I play the what-if scenario in my head every day. Unfortunately, it doesn't change anything. This is honestly a bitter ending. It doesn't seem fair at all. That's the thing about life. It's actually never fair. I want to thank everyone who gave me advice and to everyone who reached out and offered their support in the chat. I was very lonely at the time. I really appreciate your support. After my father passed away, my sister was devastated. She was struggling with feelings of guilt about how things ended between her and my father. She was spending weeks crying, barely eating, and trying to figure out how to move forward. I was trying to be there for her as much as I could, but it was difficult. I was also dealing with my own grief and anger about how things had played out. I wasn't sure how to handle her breakdown on top of everything else. Then, just when I thought we might be able to start picking up the pieces, Mom dropped a bomb on us. She called me up one night, completely out of the blue, and said she needed to talk. I could hear it in her voice that something was really wrong, so I went over to her place, dreading whatever it was she was about to say. When I got there, Mom was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her. She was visibly upset and immediately picked up her phone as if it were the source of her distress. She then looked up at me with tired eyes and said, "John's been cheating on me." The atmosphere in the room suddenly felt tense and awkward. I was at a loss for words and unsure of how to react. This was the same John she had left her husband for. The same John who had caused so much pain in our family. Now he was betraying her too. She proceeded to tell me how she had discovered this, claiming that she had noticed he was being more secretive lately. She always kept a close eye on his phone, taking calls in the other room. At first, she didn't want to believe it. She thought maybe she was just being paranoid. But then she saw the messages. They were from a younger woman, complete with all the flirty emojis and late night "I miss you" messages that make your skin crawl. Mom confronted John. She hoped he'd deny it, maybe even apologize and beg for forgiveness. But instead, he just admitted to it. He didn't even seem sorry. He just kind of shrugged it off, saying something about how things just happen and how their relationship wasn't what it used to be. It was the kind of response that made you realize just how little he cared about anyone but himself. Mom was devastated. She told him she wanted a divorce right then and there. John didn't even try to fight it. He didn't try to save their marriage. He just agreed, like he was relieved she was the one making the decision. It was over as quickly as it had started. I felt a weird mix of emotions when I heard what my mom had to say. On the one hand, I was furious at John for hurting my mom the way he did. On the other hand, I felt a twisted sense of justice. He was finally getting a taste of his own medicine, and I couldn't help but feel a little satisfied. But the real shock came when Sarah found out Sarah had been so close to John. She'd practically chosen him over her dad. And now this. When Mom told her, it was like watching someone's whole world crumble in front of you. Sarah completely broke down. She kept saying she couldn't believe she'd defended him. She'd pushed her dad away for this man who turned out to be just as bad as everyone had warned her. Sarah's guilt went into overdrive. She started replaying everything in her head. The way she'd treated her dad. The things she'd done. She said that she had made some bad decisions and now she felt like she had wasted her whole life. She was angry, but more than that she was heartbroken. She had trusted him and he had betrayed her in the worst possible way. It had shattered her. She moved out of the house she and John had been living in and went to stay with a friend. She couldn't stand to be around him. Couldn't blame her. It was like every good memory she had. Every kind word he'd ever said turned into a lie. Meanwhile, Mom was dealing with her own mess. The divorce was ugly. John tried to get as much out of it as he could, even though he was the one who had cheated. There were arguments over money, property, and everything. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing you couldn't do anything to stop it. The worst part was seeing how all of this was affecting Sarah. Sarah was already on the brink after her father's passing, and this only exacerbated the situation. She withdrew from almost everyone and isolated herself from the world. I tried to reach out and be there for her, but she wasn't receptive. She kept saying she needed time to figure things out on her own, which was understandable. Sarah had always been the strong one, the one who knew what she wanted and pursued it. But now, she was lost, and I didn't know how to help her find her way. I didn't know how to help her find her way back. She kept saying how much she regretted everything and how she wished she could go back and do it all differently. But we both knew that wasn't possible. On top of all this, there was the fallout from the divorce, which was affecting the whole family. My mom was leaning on me more and more, needing help with the legal stuff and with the emotional fallout. As much as I wanted to be there for her, it was hard. I couldn't shake the feeling that if she hadn't left him in the first place, none of this would have happened. But it's done, and now we're all dealing with the fallout. The family was split down the middle. Some were on my mom's side, saying she was the victim and that John had always been bad news. Others couldn't get past the fact that she'd been the one to start this whole mess. By leaving Dad in the first place, it made for some pretty awkward get-togethers with people taking sides and arguing about who was to blame. Then there was Sarah, caught in the middle of it all. She was angry at Mom for not seeing John's true colors sooner. She was also angry at herself for not listening to everyone who tried to warn her. But more than anything, she was just sad. Sad that she'd lost so much and pushed away the one person who always I don't know where we go from here. The family feels broken in a way that I'm not sure can ever be fixed. Sarah's trying to rebuild her life, but it's clear she's struggling. She's in therapy trying to work through everything, but it's going to be a long road. Mom, well, she's trying to pick up the pieces too, but it's hard to feel sorry for her when she's the one who set this whole thing in motion. As for M,